It's Mark Leslie coming to you from Hamilton's Asylum for the Insane, Century Manor, which you can see behind me. Beautiful old building. I'm just going to walk backwards towards it so you can get in the background. And this is from the book Haunted Hospitals, which is a book that I co-wrote with Rhonda Parrish. And this is the last surviving building of the Hamilton Asylum for the Insane. And it is allegedly a haunted building. So I'm going to share a couple stories with you from that today. And some of them go back to the folks like Stephanie from Haunted Hamilton, which is a group, a paranormal group here in Hamilton that does a lot of amazing ghost tours, etc. And one of the stories involves when they were doing a photo shoot in the building, back when there was more access to the building. You can tell it's boarded up behind me right now. But this was back when they were allowing more people access. And one of the reasons that they don't allow access any longer, even for Doors Open Hamilton, is because of the asbestos and some of the dangers inside, because the building hasn't been kept up. But it's a beautiful Victorian Gothic architecture building, which you can see. I'm just going to turn so you can get a view of the whole building. And it is a gorgeous building that, you know, for historical purposes, you want to see preserved. And Stephanie was in with a couple colleagues, and they were doing a photo shoot here, and weird noises were heard around the building while they were doing their photo shoot. And then when they moved from one room and back out to another, they came back in, they'd heard this weird metal scraping sound. And when they got back, they found a bedpan. Yes, like a bedpan that you would find in an old hospital. They just found that in the middle of the room, and they weren't sure where it had come from or who or what had placed it there. I'm just coming around the back of the building. You may be able to see behind me the beautiful billion-dollar new St. Joseph healthcare facility on the West 5th campus, but I'm just walking around the back of this building, and we don't have access to the inside of it, unfortunately, obviously for safety reasons. But you can still get right up close to the building, and of course lots of people come by and get their pictures taken in front of the building. But even those who are supposed to be here have had some weird experiences. So I often do talks, and one time when I was at the Hamilton Public Library and I was doing a talk about some haunted locales, a gentleman had approached me at the end of my talk, and he said, "I've got a story to tell you about back in the 70s when I was a security guard." And, pardon me, so we went out for a coffee together so he could relay the full story to me. And so he was working at their Stelco, or one of the industries here in Hamilton. But in the evenings he was working as a security guard. And there was not just this building here, Century Manor, but there were a few other buildings, and many of them are connected by these underground tunnels. This is the last remaining building of that asylum. And when he was working in the building by himself, doing an overnight shift, of course he was tired. So he had mentioned saying that it was great to be able to be walking around all night, because if he had been sitting behind a desk, he most likely would have just fallen asleep because he'd been working all day as well. But he was walking around, he was doing the patrols, because in an abandoned building that's closed up, there's often the risk that there's going to be people who break in for thrill-seeking reasons, etc., especially because there have been stories of ghosts in the building. And as he was walking down the corridor, he heard voices down the end of the corridor coming from what he thought were behind this door at the end of the corridor. And so as he slowly approached, he's thinking, okay, I caught them. You know, it's obviously a little bit more of an exciting night than just walking around being bored and trying not to fall asleep. So he gets down to the end of the corridor. He still hears the voices on the other side of the door. He opens the door, and he finds two women standing in the room, dressed in old nurse period costumes. And they're having a conversation, an animated conversation. And one of them turns, looks at him, then looks back at her friend and says, "See, I told you he would hear us." So he's freaked out at this point. At this particular point, he ends up closing the door, stepping back into the hallway and thinking, okay, I'm overtired. I have no idea what I just saw. Maybe I imagined what they were wearing. Maybe it was a couple students. What's going on? Maybe they're in Halloween costumes. So he opens the door again, and there's nobody there. So he's a little bit freaked out by this point. Of course, he's a little bit freaked out at this point, but he continues his rounds because, you know, he's diligent in his duties. And while he's walking down this one particular corridor, a long corridor, he said it's kind of like that pressure. You know, when you're in a home and it's windy and you've got windows open across the way, and the air pressure is something that's going to push at the doors and cause all kinds of weird noises and feelings in the air. He said it kind of felt that way, except as he was walking down this hallway, the pressure, the air pressure that seemed to be building up in this hallway was getting stronger and stronger and stronger, in such a way that he actually felt something pushing against him and pushing him down the hallway. At that particular point, it built to a crescendo and then completely stopped. And that's the point where he went to the nearest exit. He left the building, he walked down the road, because this was back in the days well before cell phones, and he picked up, he got the nearest payphone, he called his bosses at the security company, and he said, "I quit, I'm not going back in that building, and I don't need the money that bad." And that was sort of the end of that little expose. So those are just some of the things that have happened here at Century Manor, here the Hamilton Asylum for the Insane. At one point in time, this was a massive facility, and we're on the Hamilton Mountain on the escarpment, and this would be this beautiful picturesque grounds. I'm just going to sort of pan so you can just kind of see the breadth of what's here. You can't even see the breadth of the full range here. What you have is right behind me is the new St. Joseph's healthcare facility. But there were buildings that had been torn down that were originally part of the Hamilton Asylum for the Insane. And it was upwards of 1,000 patients and about 120 people who were employed here. They even had their own tailors. They had their own butcher. They had their own farm here in the location. It was a self-sustaining community that could take care of itself. And it was quite a gorgeous facility, quite a state-of-the-art facility at one point in time. The only thing left, of course, is this beautiful Victorian Gothic building, Century Manor. And there is talk that Mohawk College, which is just across the street on Fennel, that they're looking at renovating this into a residence. Now, the work there hasn't been finalized, but it would make a very beautiful and historic residence. And it hasn't happened yet, but I can only imagine that if there is any particular stories to be shared, that most certainly the students who are staying here are going to be able to discover things as they're staying there, obviously not just for a few hours, but for night after night after night. Again, Mark Leslie at Century Manor here in Hamilton, Ontario, this beautiful stately mansion. I hope you enjoyed this free Friday Fright, and I hope you have a fantastic weekend.